student, actually, in the Department of Indigenous Studies at the University of Saskatchewan. And I was asked to come and deliver this keynote to this really unique conference. And I remember I got the email and I was wondering, I'd never seen a conference like this before, so I'm going to sit on it and think about it. And my colleague, Matt Dunn, who works in engineering, showed up at my office and he said, Mylan, there's this cool conference going on, everyone's going to be in the room together, and you should go and talk. I said, about what? Whatever you want to talk about. And I said, okay, cool, I'll think about it. Matt goes back to his office, and I get a phone call from Rebecca, literally right after. She's like, Mylan, I'm putting up this cool conference, an Indigenous Water Forum. You should talk. And my name kept coming up in a lot of the work that on campus with some of the communities and departments I work with. And in all reality, to be honest, me doing my PhD currently and looking at water governance and Indigenous governance sort of came about a few years ago. I took a class at the Global Institute for Water Security taught by Dr. Patricia Gober. Some of the master's students may be familiar with their work, where you're looking at water policy and looking at the relationships that policy, economics, and things like that have with water. And taking that course, I realized, wow, there's something going on here. There's something unique playing out on the landscape. And the reason I took it to heart specifically was because I got to acknowledge first and foremost that I'm a Nehewak person, a Cree person, coming from Cree people. This is my people's indigenous territory. This is where my feet first touched the ground. This is where my ancestors are buried. And when I was taking this course, I opened up my mind and my heart to the current realities of the water systems and water in the Western Prairie provinces. And I was baffled, not because it was new information, not because I was learning something new for the first time, but because I was hearing non-natives begin to verify what our old people talk about. Begin to verify what our wisdom keepers, our Gidea, our old people, our wise elders speak about in terms of our stories. We heard this morning Mr. Carrier from Cumberland House talk about 40 years ago when he walked into the store, he saw lumber or wood for sale. And the old people up there said, one day you're going to see water for sale. You're going to walk into the store. And we have a similar story around Poundmaker, where when we would get gas, my older cousins, they would talk about when they would get gas, they would just walk into the gas station and fill up their water bottles, fill up water jugs, and hit the road. And the old people used to say, you kids, one day when you walk into that gas station to get gas, and you're going to have to buy water there. You're not going to be able to drink it from the tap. And it was baffling at the time. And I have older cousins who are in their 40s who tell me when they would be able to drink the tap water, be able to drink the tap water in the local communities while they're on the road. And I want to acknowledge my teachers. Not only my formal academic teachers like Patricia Gober, Howard Weeder, Robert Inez, and my master's profs and things like that, but the community practitioners. A lot of the information I'm sharing with you comes from my community. My late father, Mylan Tootoosis, shared a lot of information with me and that he learned from his late father, John B. Tootoosis. And John B. Tootoosis learning from Anton Lonesinger from Sweetgrass, and John Skibos from Coacatus, and Pat Chatsis. And there's an old man from Little Pine. His Indian name was Chickene Sis. And my dad doesn't remember his English name. That's how old he was, this old man they had to watch. So a lot of those stories, when I began to sit in this water policy class and looking at pending water crisis in the Western Prairie provinces, I began to verify those stories or that information with some of the traditional knowledge that we have back home. So I'm going to bring to you a presentation that's coming from the Indigenous perspective, not so much the formal academic perspective. What's so cool about this conference is there's literally brown faces and white faces in the audience. And me as a PhD student, I sometimes only present to white faces, and I get called home or into First Nations communities to present to brown faces. So when I was sitting there trying to do this PowerPoint and put it together, I was like, how am I going to navigate this now? Because there's a mix in the room, which is so cool about it, right? I like that. But we're going to break it down, right? The goal of this keynote and the goal of this talk is to begin to understand the overall landscape and what is meant by when I say pending water crisis. That's going to be one goal. And we're going to look at some work that I found stimulating as a PhD student. And second goal is we'll understand the dynamics impacting indigenous communities, right? My colleague Ranjan Datta said, and they put it up on the board, is that some of the problems we're looking at are really short-minded and short-sighted. Some of the problems we're trying to solve in terms of water and infrastructure have been long-standing problems for hundreds of years. What does that mean? We're going to look at that and try and pinpoint the source from my perspective and my work. The goal is to understand multiple perspectives and multiple approaches and new ways of striving for solutions. I always get called to present to chief and councils. I'm also a life skills coach, and I do youth programs in communities, and I love presenting about governance and new ways of thinking about governance. So I developed this cool model I'm going to share with the room today. But looking at the Saskatchewan River water basin, it's a very dynamic system. And I have to admit that when I looked at this map, and it's a map of the North and South Saskatchewan River from the Rockies to the Delta. When I looked at this map, it was almost foreign to me, because in our cosmology and our traditional perspectives, this was part of our traditional territory. However, I realized that from the stories I heard from my father and my uncles, was that a lot of our stories took place from north to south. A north to south migration in terms of us being in the North Battleford region, but also spending a lot of our time as Neheopata people, Plains Cree Nakota people, in the Cypress Hills. And when I was looking at this map, I realized that there has to be a new way of viewing this landscape. Right? I do acknowledge our traditional territories, and I do have this affiliation with the Cypress Hills. I love going down there in the summer and driving through there. But a lot of the conversations today was concentrated on upstream and downstream concepts. Upstream users and downstream users. And I'll be probably preaching to the choir to some of the researchers and experts in the room. But the Saskatchewan River water basin is a very dynamic system. It's a very unique system. It's a transboundary system. There's a lot of industries that utilize this water. Graham Strickard made some reference to it in his presentation today. Agriculture is a big component on this landscape. So it was a very cool way of sort of like adjusting my perspective and looking at the landscape in a very unique way. And the reason I like to talk about the Saskatchewan River overall is because sometimes I feel, and I'm speaking specifically to the Indigenous people, we forget how important the practical relationship is to water, right? We understand water is sacred. We understand that it's a valuable component in our cosmology and in our ways of life. But one of the things we need to understand is we have to maintain a practical relationship with the waters that exist in our immediate territories. There's a lot of talk about young people, and I was one of them, that to go down to Standing Rock and partake in the Dakota Access Pipeline protest. And it's an interesting development. There's lots going on this afternoon. I've been following it on social media. They're trying to stop the Dakota Access Pipeline from crossing the Missouri River for fear of an oil spill in the future. But like it was said this morning in one of the presentations, was that there's literally pipelines going beneath the North and South Saskatchewan River in our Indigenous territory up here. Right? So as Indigenous people, we have to maintain those practical relationships and understandings of what this landscape means and the power and the potential it has to be relative to us in the future. And like Graham Strickard said this morning, the Saskatchewan River is actually fed a lot by the Rocky Mountains. Right? And when I was sitting in that water policy class, what I'm talking about when I say a lot of our traditional stories are being verified was we know of a time when water is going to be of a scarce commodity. It's not going to be as accessible. And when Mr. Carrier said, the old people said there'll be a time when you buy water, what is it our old people are saying today about 40 years down the line? What are those stories that are still active today about 40 years down the line? So when I say pending water crisis, I'm not referring to the global climate change data. I'm not referring to, the pending water crisis data. What I'm referring to is the oral histories that we have access to in our indigenous communities. One thing I always tell indigenous young children is ask your mushrooms and cocoas those stories. What's coming down the pipeline, right, in terms of landscape? What's coming down the pipeline in terms of environment? Right? Because our stories say there's hard times coming, challenging times coming. Right? And when I was hearing Patricia Grover's work, when I was reading some of the work in the Global Institute of Water Security, they began to quantify our prophecies, where we can actually look at data now and look at changing landscapes, where we can look at changing waterscapes, changing relationships and dynamics to water. And so that was my big epiphany as an indigenous scholar and an indigenous researcher, was there's ways to mobilize people, and there's ways to not only mobilize traditional knowledge, but utilize Western science for the benefit of our communities and people. So, what can I do? That was my question, right? What can I do, and how do I apply what I'm learning to help my people? And one of the core things that I began to dive into was this field called political ecology. Basically looking at the ways we measure multiple dynamics and multiple impacts and accesses to environment. So basically just casting a wide net is how I like to explain political ecology. And one of the things that came to mind when I was looking at political ecology was there's a lot of deep-rooted issues in terms of indigenous communities, in terms of water infrastructure, in terms of the overall indigenous question in Canada. There's a lot of problems still taking place. There's still a lot of problems that exist that are years old and are unresolved. And in all reality, it's colonialism. When we're looking at why our stories aren't being taken serious, when we're looking at why our traditional knowledge systems aren't being taken serious, when we're looking at why these solutions or these practices we're trying to apply to indigenous communities, why they're not working is because they're not meant to work. We're not allowed to help our communities on the level we need to help our communities. And I'm saying that as an indigenous person. And the reason that is because there's still colonial agendas at play. There's still paternalistic agendas at play. There's still control agendas at play, where there's still this assumption that indigenous people need to be removed from the landscape. And there's three key questions. I added a third one while I was sitting there eating my meal. There's three key questions we need to ask. The first one for indigenous people, and for those who are doing community-based research or doing projects in indigenous communities, ask the community, where does your water come from? When I do frontline work and community development work, that's one question I always ask is, where does your water come from? No matter what community I visit, non-native or indigenous, I ask them. And some people have good answers, some people don't know, some people don't have that relationship. The next question I like to ask, who owns that water? This concept of ownership. Who has title to that water? And who is entitled to that water? Right? A lot of our young people and a lot of community members in First Nations communities can't answer that question. We know water is sacred. We know water belongs to everybody. But the systems that we're operating under are under the assumption that that water does not belong to indigenous people. That water now belongs to the nation state, the colonial state, and the systems that are governing it. We see that on the provincial level happening right now. Okay? And so the third question for researchers and people who are doing frontline work in the room is, what paradigm are the solutions coming from? Is that a colonial paradigm? Is that a paradigm that's rooted in I need to save these indigenous people from themselves? Is it the paradigm that Canada has rule and title to these lands, so let's fix this problem? Let's help our Indians. I'm also an Indigenous 107 prof. I lectured in that great paper sometimes for Indigenous 107. And it's so interesting how non-native Canadians want to help our Indians, our Indian children. Right? This notion that we belong to Canada, or that these lands belong to Canada, how much is that driving your concept of research? How much of that is driving your concept of wanting to try and find those solutions? So long as those solutions are coming from a colonial paradigm, they're not going to be successful. They're not going to work. You're shooting yourself in the foot. And that bugs me. Because I admire frontline workers. I admire people who are going to the communities and asking questions and want to help. It takes a certain type of person. And not everybody's like that. My heart goes out to frontline workers. Asking those questions and taking the time out of their lives to get on the ground, to keep their boots to the ground. But that's one thing I wanted to highlight and expand on. Was what is this notion of land and water ownership? Right? Because they're preconceived notions. Right? Social science and Indigenous studies, we do look at those preconceived notions. We try to deconstruct them in our graduate students and in our undergraduates. And it's unsettling for non-native students to take our classes and realize that this land in Treaty 6 territory was never surrendered. That we never gave up title to this land. Right? And sometimes along the process, they get really scared to the point of where they get angry, and we have to sort of get them back to this point of being open and receiving, because sometimes when they realize, okay, I need to erase this myth that I own this land, there's a fear that they're going to erase themselves in treaty territory. But the reality is that in Treaty 6 territory, we never did surrender our lands to Canada. We don't have a treaty with Canada, we have a treaty with Canada. And more importantly, treaty doesn't send people home. Indigenous concepts of Treaty 6 and treaties in general were rooted in peace and diplomacy. And like in Mylan Tootoosis' presentation today, he said the depth of a plow, which means that in Treaty 6, Treaty 4, we acknowledge that, okay, there's going to be settlers coming, they need to feed their children, they need land to farm, so let's give them, some shared rights to the depth of a plow. Now, if we were to flip the script on that and look at that as a very cool, unique environmental policy, imagine that. If we were to apply the depth of a plow rooted in Indigenous concepts of sharing the land, rooted in Indigenous peace and diplomacy, imagine how environmental policy would change. Right? Imagine how the nation-to-nation relationship would change. We begin to remove that colonial paradigm. Right? It's time to take treaty relationships serious. It's time to take Indigenous nationhood and Indigenous land serious. In this slide, I know it's a small picture. That's my home territory. That's on Poundmaker Hill. In the back, Iskigomamna, Broken Knife Hill. 2 stories in this picture. The hill I'm standing on when I took the picture is where Colonel Otter in Canada attacked us in 1876, or 1885, sorry. And we fought, and we defended our women, we defended our children, and we defended our right to exist, and we won. That hill on the back is an older story, where we fought a Blackfoot warrior, and my community, my tribal group won. So this notion of being able to live on a land and on a landscape that we have ties to, deep ties to, has to be the premise for a lot of the projects that are coming out and that want to work with Indigenous people. So this notion of land and water ownership, acknowledging that colonialism is taking place, acknowledging that there's a colonial agenda taking place in many regards. The reality is that when we're looking at colonialism, and looking at settler colonial regimes, basically what settler colonialism is, where people who aren't Indigenous to that territory attempt to make that Indigenous territory their land and home. That's how we break it down. Not only their land and home, but their source of capital, their source of generating money, their source of generating wealth. Right? And the conflict there is that in Indigenous lands and Indigenous concepts of land and water, the land and water is inherent to our survival. our cultural survival, our political survival, our spiritual survival, the overall physical well-being of who we are as an Indigenous people is specifically tied to the land that a colonial paradigm and agenda is trying to take over. So taking this notion of land, when we're looking at this commodification of land and water, basically the commodification of a lot of projects and research projects, keeping in mind that Indigenous lands, Indigenous peoples, Indigenous communities are being commodified. There's a lot of work being done where they're acknowledging or looking at how much money is being generated off the Indian question in Canada. How much money are lawyers making off the TRC Commission? How much money is being made off of these supposed solutions that are going to help our communities and aren't working? So this commodification of land and water and of Indigenous people basically is one of the big problems that we have to begin to address and keep in mind when we're looking at wanting to offer help to First Nations communities, right? In other words, we're looking at settler colonialism, and I'm referring to an article we use in our field called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor by Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang. Both economic practices that are sort of the left and right in settler colonial politics. Both left and right political paradigms view the land and natural resources as commodities to be exploited. In the first instance, capitalists for personal gain, and the left, Marxists, for the good of all. Not acknowledging that the Indigenous principles of peace and diplomacy were already at play during times of treaty signing, that peace and diplomacy were already the intention of the original peoples who lived there. Technologies and creations of colonialism developed over the time to further colonial projects. Racism is an invention of colonialism. Racism being an invention of colonialism basically means that those preconceived notions that we have of Indigenous people on the reserves, that we have of Indigenous people that we see walking down the street, those preconceived notions where we don't know where they come from, they just come up. When I see that Indian walking down the street, and what's that first thought I have, are an invention of colonialism. We have to other the Indigenous people. So the question is, for a lot of the researchers, when we're looking at wanting to create those solutions for those communities, what are my preconceived notions of that community to begin with? What paradigm am I operating in? So when we're looking at it from the Indigenous perspective, from the treaty perspective, right, from the perspective of lands and waters, keeping in mind that in Treaty 6 territory, we never formally surrendered our lands and waters, or title to our lands and waters, that the colonial agenda is heavily promoted by largely pro-assimilationist media and mainstream non-Indigenous scholars. And I wanted to put these quotes up there from the Eve Tuck and Yang article, because working in the fields I'm working in, I don't know if it's a conscious or unconscious behavior to assume that the best course of action for Indigenous communities is to begin to further colonize and absorb them into the Canadian politic. I don't know if that's a conscious or unconscious behavior. And that's sort of scary because I do see a lot of good-hearted people out there wanting to help communities, but aren't realizing that sometimes those solutions are coming from the paradigm of assimilation. The paradigm of creating policies that are going to govern these people. They can't govern themselves. I'm going to do a project where I'm going to show them, or where we're going to find ways to govern them better. Goal is the integration into the market economy and cultural assimilation advanced as the only viable pathways to a better life for First Nations people and communities. Again, deconstructing that colonial paradigm is super important. Right? What's going to save these communities? What paradigm is that coming from? We have to be critical of that as scholars. We have to be critical of that as Indigenous scholars. We have to be critical of that as Western scholars who want to help Indigenous communities. This perspective is obviously at the center of a lot of governmental policy, and it's fair to say forms the view of the vast majority of the Canadian population. Right? That the best way to solve the Indian problems is to absorb them into the market economy, or advance them further into the Canadian politic. in general. I know it's uncomfortable to talk about colonialism and colonization. I think that's sometimes why a lot of my colleagues want to call me and have me talk about it. Because a lot of my research in my master's program concentrated on indigenous governance, colonialism, and decolonization. But getting into the brighter side of things now, after this slide. 4 specific impacts of colonization, right? Part of why we need good, tangible, awesome projects in our communities is the result of colonialism to begin with, right? 4 impacts is disorientation, rapid loss of lands and peoples, right? Leading to the disorientation of our communities, and we still see that today on multiple levels. Disempowerment, due to the coercive enforcement of colonial laws and policies by government authorities. Discord, resulting from people's inability to fulfill traditional political, social, cultural, and spiritual obligations to people's lands and waters. Right? So a social discord. Disease. Right? A lot of disease. A lot of high rates of heart disease and diabetes. There's cancer clusters in a lot of First Nations communities that need to be looked at. So when we're looking at these impacts of colonization, we have to realize that we are working in highly vulnerable communities. And are our projects and our paradigms exploiting that vulnerability? We have to be critical of that. We have to think from that lens. Because sometimes a lot of communities are being exploited economically. A lot of communities are being exploited for research purposes. That was said today in one of the talks. Is who's this research benefiting from? Who's this research benefiting? You know, those helicopter research where they come in, do this project, and they leave, and we never hear from them again. So, for the Indigenous people in the room, there's this cool article that came out of Australia, written by Brian Head. He calls it Wicked Problems, Identifying Wicked Problems. The reality is, when we're looking at these highly vulnerable communities, that there's a lot of problems that require new ways of thinking to be solved. And he identifies a wicked problem as some of the most difficult policy problems of the modern era, including water and natural resources, sustainability. They have been described as complex, intractable, open-ended, and wicked. So when he's looking at wicked problems, the indigenous realities our communities are full of them. So when we're going in just to solve one problem, we have to realize that that one problem has a relationship with multiple problems. It's hard to hit one nail on the head. It's like whacking a mole. When we come in and we hit it, yes, you got that, 5 nails pop up. Right? So the most challenging places to work are Indigenous communities. And I can say that as a frontline worker and someone who grew up in my community. Right? They're highly stressful. Like I said, I'm also a life skills coach. My parents have been in the mental health field for 25 years. And they're a part of citizen teams. They're a part of first respond teams. My late father, I remember being a little kid and him getting calls at 3 in the morning saying there's a suicide. Can you come and speak to the family? Can you come and sit with the family? And him waking up at 3 a.m. going to that community. And me not realizing that how much stress that probably caused my family, how much stress that probably caused my father and the family who lost a loved one. So they're highly stressful on multiple levels. Right? And on top of that, we have to worry about clean drinking water. Is the water getting us sick? Right? We're losing a lot of young people in our problems. These are in our communities. And there's multiple problems, like I said earlier. Governance has a hard time fixing these problems. Right? A lot of chief and councils who want to get in there and create change could attest to this. You try to fix one problem, you can't fix that problem because you have to fix 6 problems before you can even get to that problem. And it requires multiple disciplines and skill sets to solve. Right? So when we're looking at this from the perspective of not only water infrastructure but governance, not only from governance and water infrastructure but also even the social dynamics in communities, we're looking at highly complex issues that are interlapped and intertangled, with a lot of uncertain outcomes of what happens if we try and solve this problem, what other problems are going to emerge. Right? A lot of divergent thought. Right? Even in the First Nations community, political thought. What's the best course of action politically? What's the best course of action socially? And a lot of disagreements happening. So these wicked problems are in existence. And you have to keep in mind that First Nations communities are highly vulnerable and they're dealing with multiple problems. The example I can give you as an Indigenous person is I personally don't view the social problems separate from the environmental problems. For me, they're the same. I don't have the privilege of saying I'm not going to concentrate on the Colton Bushi shooting, and I'm only going to concentrate on the oil spill, because they're affecting my community on both fronts. So that's an example there. Right? We have recent events happening in Saskatchewan. So what is decolonization? One of the solutions we need is that we need to solve the problems not only from the simple core water infrastructure problem or the simple core governance problem. We have to look at a wider spectrum. We have to have a panoramic view of what communities we're going into and what problems are there. We have to keep in mind those panoramic solutions, right? Looking at Indigenous lands and life as the primary goal for a lot of water infrastructure problems, a lot of water problems in general, environmental problems. The goal is to maintain and continue Indigenous life, right? Literally, a lot of research projects could promote a better quality of life, and we know that. Right? So when we're looking at that, when you hear a lot of talk about decolonization, when you hear a lot of talk about Indigenous nationhood, they're not just metaphors. They're actual real practices and goals for Indigenous communities. So that's what we have to address and think of, what is the paradigm am I operating under? Am I really striving to promote Indigenous life? Or am I striving to maintain the colonial relationship and dynamic? So, one of the tools I want to give you, some of my PhD research currently looks at these 5 pillars, right? And you can call it whatever. I call it a decolonial framework. I call it an Indigenous livelihood framework. 5 pillars, 5 areas that always need to be considered in every project. Can you see those little points up there? No, I'll read them to you, okay? So the first pillar is political. What is the political reality of the community I'm working in? What are their politics? What are they practicing? What are they striving for? Second is economic. What is the economics of the community I'm working in? Environmental, what are the environmental concerns playing out? Social. What are the social concerns playing out in this community? Spirituality and cosmological. Number 5. What's the spirituality of this community? Right? And when you assess these 5 pillars and apply it to a research project, you're basically casting a wide net to catch more fish, to be more successful. Right? Because from my perspective, as an Indigenous person growing up in a reserve, we have a lot of lawyers come in who are only concentrating on the political side of things. And this is where I say, I don't want our researchers and these projects to shoot themselves in the foot. We have a lot of people who come in only concentrating on one paradigm. And when I assessed Indigenous communities in my research,